Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale unfolds with emotion, suspense, and unforgettable moments. Today, we bring you a gripping story of courage, justice, and the power of one child's bravery to change everything. Officer Frank Reynolds never expected that a quiet suburban street would lead him to uncover a horrifying trafficking operation. But when a little girl named Maya whispers a single word, his world shifts, and a life-or-death race against time begins. Join us as we dive into this compelling journey of hope, determination, and the search for truth. Don't forget to like and subscribe to start today's story with Life Stories. It was a quiet afternoon. The kind of day that felt like it was suspended in time. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns of Maple Street. The familiar hum of suburban life surrounded me, the clink of garden tools, the distant laughter of children, the occasional car driving by. I had always found some comfort in these mundane, everyday scenes. Yet, as I cruised down the street in my patrol car, they seemed to taunt me, reminding me of everything I had lost. It had been 5 years since my son, Jimmy, passed away. The thought of him, of his bright smile and the sound of his laughter, still had the power to squeeze my heart like a vice. He would have been 12 this year. The pain didn't lessen, it simply became a part of me, lurking in the background like a shadow that never left. I had to push those thoughts aside now. Focus on the job. The radio crackled with the usual list of complaints: a missing cat, a dog running loose, a noise disturbance on Oak Avenue. I responded mechanically, my mind elsewhere, until something caught my eye. A small figure stood by Mrs. Wilson's flower garden, completely still. I slowed the car, my eyes narrowing. It was a little girl, no more than 5 years old, standing with her back to me. Her blue dress was too big for her, and she had no shoes. She was clutching a worn teddy bear, holding it like it was her lifeline. I pulled the patrol car over to the curb, my instincts already telling me something wasn't right. Most kids her age would at least glance over at a police car, maybe even wave. But not her. She stood there, motionless, her gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. I got out of the car, walking slowly, trying not to startle her. "Hey there," I called softly. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I knelt down, keeping my distance, trying to make myself seem less threatening. "Are you lost?" I asked gently. The little girl didn't respond. Her brown eyes were wide and unblinking, her small fingers clutching the bear tighter. I glanced down at her bare feet, dirty from walking on the sidewalk. Scratches marred her legs, as though she had wandered through rough terrain. My concern deepened. I was about to try again when I heard it. A word. Barely more than a whisper. But it hit me like a punch to the gut. Danger. The word hung in the air for a moment, thick with meaning. I froze. My training kicked in, and my heart raced. What was this child afraid of? Where was the danger? I leaned forward slightly. "Where's the danger, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice calm but urgent. "Can you show me?" She hesitated for a moment, her trembling hand slowly lifting from her teddy bear. Then, her small finger pointed across the street, directly at the house on the corner. Mr. Harper's house. I knew Mr. Harper. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but always polite when I'd seen him around. Nothing about him ever raised any red flags. But there was something in the little girl's eyes, something I had seen before. A shadow of fear that sent a chill down my spine. I glanced between the house and the girl, weighing my options. I had a gut feeling something was terribly wrong. Children's fears weren't always unfounded. And when they spoke, they often knew more than they let on. I reached for my radio, my eyes never leaving the girl. "Dispatch. This is Unit 247. I need a soft perimeter on Willow Street between Oak and Maple. Keep it quiet. No sirens." I paused, trying to make sure I sounded calm despite the alarms ringing in my head. Unit 247. Copy that. Any specific concerns? The dispatcher responded. Just a precaution. I replied. Better safe than sorry. I turned back to the girl, whose name I would later learn was Emma. She stood perfectly still, her teddy bear held tightly against her chest. There was no trace of the curiosity a child her age should have. Instead, her eyes stayed locked on the house across the street, and her tiny body trembled despite the warmth in the air. Stay close to me. Okay, I said, my voice soft, trying to reassure her. Emma nodded, and for the first time, I saw her move. She took a tentative step toward me, her bare feet padding softly on the concrete. We crossed the street together, our shadows stretching long behind us in the late afternoon sun. As we approached Mr. Harper's house, I couldn't help but notice that the front door was slightly ajar, a gap of about 2 inches. The breeze made it creak, the sound cutting through the quiet of the neighborhood. My heart rate quickened. This wasn't right. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, instinctively placing a hand on my holstered weapon. The door was open. That wasn't something I should ignore. I called out, "Mr. Harper." My voice was strong, but I could feel the tension in my throat. "This is Officer Reynolds. Is everything okay in there?" There was no answer. The only sound was the hum of the television coming from somewhere inside the house. I pulled out my flashlight and drew my weapon, keeping it pointed down to avoid alarming the girl. "Mr. Harper, I'm coming in to check on you," I said, my voice steady. I turned to Emma, who had backed away slightly. She was holding her teddy bear even tighter now, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay right here, sweetheart. Don't move from this spot." "Okay." She nodded, her fingers still gripping the worn bear. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the faint creak of the hinges. The hallway was dark, despite the afternoon sun outside, and my flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating the space. The air inside was stale and heavy. I could hear the television, the faint sound of a game show or some sitcom, but something felt off. I moved further in, the beam of my flashlight catching family photos on the walls, dusty picture frames, and an old couch. Everything seemed normal, yet nothing felt right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't explain why, but my gut told me something wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Then, a sound behind me made me freeze. The sudden creak of the floorboards. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. And there stood Mr. Harper. He was holding a coffee cup, his wrinkled khakis and stained white undershirt making him appear disheveled and out of place in the otherwise tidy home. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" he demanded, his voice gruff, eyes narrowing at me. I didn't respond immediately. I was too busy taking in the situation. Something wasn't adding up. His hand was shaking, and the coffee spilled over the rim of his cup, splashing onto the floor. "Mr. Harper," I said, my voice steady, "I'm sorry for the intrusion, but we received a report of possible danger at this address." "Danger?" he scoffed, looking confused. "The only danger here is you breaking into my house. I was just taking a nap upstairs." I held my ground. Something about the way he was acting wasn't right. The way he avoided eye contact, the nervous tremor in his hands, all of it added up to a gut feeling I couldn't shake. As I stood there, trying to make sense of everything, Emma's small voice interrupted my thoughts. She had quietly appeared in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Mr. Harper, her body trembling. "Who's this little girl?" Mr. Harper asked, his voice suddenly softer, almost too gentle. Emma stepped forward, her teddy bear still in hand, and pointed toward the basement door. The small, raised arm, as if it had been practiced, caused my heart to sink. There was something behind that door, something Emma wanted me to see. I turned to Mr. Harper. "I need you to sit down in that armchair. Right now." My tone was firm, my hand instinctively reaching for my weapon. He hesitated, his face flickering between fear and defiance. But in the end, he obeyed. Sinking slowly into the chair, I moved cautiously toward the basement door, keeping my eyes on Mr. Harper, trying to read him, trying to figure out what he was hiding. The door creaked open with a slight push. The staircase led into complete darkness, and my flashlight beam revealed what I had feared. The clutter of the basement, the old paint cans, the cobwebs. But underneath all that, something was wrong. Something felt off in the very air. And I knew, deep down, this wasn't just a case of a worried father or an upset neighbor. This was something far worse. And Emma, the quiet little girl with the haunted eyes, had shown me the way. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, the flashlight in my hand shaking slightly as I peered into the darkness. My heart was beating faster than usual, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Emma's pointed finger, her silent indication toward the basement door, echoed in my mind like a warning bell. There was something wrong here. I had been an officer for over 20 years, and my gut had never been wrong before. But this felt different. The house was too quiet, and Mr. Harper's behavior had shifted too quickly from confusion to fear. And the little girl Emma, she wasn't acting like a child lost or frightened. She was acting like someone who had seen horrors no one her age should know. I took a deep breath, forcing my hand to stop shaking. My instincts had brought me here, and I wasn't going to back down now. I needed to know what was behind that door. Stay close, Emma, I said, my voice soft but firm. She nodded, gripping her teddy bear even tighter, her wide eyes following me as I took the first step onto the creaky wooden staircase. The stairs groaned under my weight, the sound sharp in the stillness. The air in the basement smelled musty, cold, and damp. I flicked the flashlight beam across the room, illuminating dusty boxes, forgotten furniture, and the occasional cobweb hanging in the corners. Everything looked ordinary, except for the overwhelming sense that this wasn't just a basement, it was a place where something had been hidden for a long time. I took another step, my boots scraping against the floor as I continued my descent. My mind raced as I swept the flashlight from side to side. The place was cluttered with all sorts of items, old Christmas decorations, forgotten children's toys, cardboard boxes filled with things no one had bothered to sort through for years. But the more I looked, the more I could tell that something wasn't right about the way everything was arranged. It was too deliberate, too organized. I kept moving, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. I had to stay alert. Too many times before, I had let my guard down, only to find that I had missed something critical. A faint noise from behind me made me freeze. I turned my head quickly, but it was only Emma, her small, fragile form standing motionless at the top of the stairs. Her wide, brown eyes were locked on me, her hands clutching her bear as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Emma, I called softly, trying to keep my voice steady. Stay right there, sweetheart. Don't move. Her gaze didn't falter. She didn't speak. But the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. I moved further into the basement, the beam of my flashlight catching something odd. It was a stack of cardboard boxes, neatly arranged and almost too perfect. A chill ran through me as I approached, my heart quickening. There were scuff marks on the concrete floor near the boxes, as if they had been moved recently, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting closer to something important. I knelt down beside the boxes and gently began shifting them aside. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I moved the boxes more deliberately, I saw it, a faded rug, its corner slightly raised. Beneath the rug, I could see the edge of a steel trapdoor. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to call for backup. But I couldn't. Not now. I had come this far. And Emma's word. Danger still rang in my ears. I couldn't ignore it. I pulled the rug back, revealing the handle of the trapdoor. It was heavy, ancient even, but it wasn't locked. There was a simple padlock hanging open, almost as if it had been left deliberately unlatched. My pulse quickened as I gripped the handle, pulling the door open slowly, carefully. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a small crawl space beneath the floor, no larger than a closet. The walls were lined with electrical equipment, and in the center of the space was a sophisticated surveillance system, complete with multiple monitors. My heart nearly stopped as I took in the sight. The monitors were live, showing different rooms. Each display showed a different child. They were young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, just like Emma. Some were sleeping on thin mattresses, others sat in corners, their faces blank and defeated. Some were so still, it was hard to tell if they were even breathing. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A sense of nausea washed over me as I realized the implications. This wasn't some innocent mistake or misunderstanding. This was a trafficking operation. And it had been happening right under my nose. The children on those screens, they were all trapped. And Emma, the girl who had led me here, had escaped it. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I took in every detail on the monitors. Each screen showed a different room, but they all had one thing in common: children. Emma hadn't just whispered danger for no reason. She had been one of the victims. And now, she had brought me to the very heart of this nightmare. I stood up, my head spinning as I processed what I had just uncovered. The trapdoor closed with a loud clang behind me, but I couldn't take my eyes off the screens. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the monitors and the steady, mechanical ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. A movement upstairs made me snap back to attention. Emma was still waiting at the top of the stairs, her wide eyes locked on mine, her body trembling with fear. But now, I could see something else in her, something new, something stronger. She had brought me here. She had trusted me to find the truth. And now, I had to make sure she wasn't alone anymore. I turned to face Mr. Harper, who was still sitting in the armchair, his hands trembling and his eyes filled with panic. "Mr. Harper," I said, my voice low but firm, "you're coming with me. Now." He didn't protest. He didn't even move. He just sat there, staring at the ground, the weight of the situation finally dawning on him. This wasn't just a house. This was a prison. And I had just unlocked its darkest secret. "Emma," I said quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You did good, kid. You're safe now. We're going to make sure of that." The room seemed to hold its breath as I led Emma out of the basement, her tiny hand gripping mine as if her life depended on it. And in many ways, it did. As I led Emma back upstairs, the weight of the discovery pressed down on me. I had seen it with my own eyes, those children, trapped, as though they were nothing more than commodities in some sick, twisted trade. I could feel the anger rising within me, the rage at what had been done to them, and the horror of knowing that Emma had been part of it. But I couldn't let that distract me. Not now. Now was the time to act, to save her, and to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. I glanced over my shoulder at her, walking quietly behind me. Her small hand clutched my sleeve, her fingers pale from the grip. She was shaking. But not from the cold. No, this was a different kind of fear. The kind that stayed with you long after the danger had passed. Emma had seen things no child should ever witness. And I knew that the scars would stay with her far longer than I could even imagine. But right now, I had to be strong for her. I had to be the protector she needed, even if it meant confronting a nightmare head-on. We reached the door to the living room. Mr. Harper had not moved from his seat, still sitting in that same chair, staring at the floor as if he had forgotten how to speak. I could see now that his hands were trembling. The coffee cup he had been holding earlier abandoned on the floor, its contents spilled, leaving a dark stain on the wood. The tension in the air was palpable. thick with the understanding that whatever was happening here was bigger than just a troubled man. It was the beginning of something far darker. I couldn't just arrest him. Not yet. Not without more answers. I had to get him to talk. To give me the full picture of what had been going on inside this house. Behind that basement door. Mr. Harper. I said firmly. Stepping closer to him. I need you to tell me what's going on. Who else is involved in this? My voice was steady. But inside. I was racing against the clock. I had no idea how long I had before backup would arrive. And every second felt like an eternity. He lifted his head slowly. His face pale and drawn. His eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man who had seen too much. Like a man who had known the truth but had been too afraid to speak it. His lips trembled as he opened his mouth. But no words came out. I could see the fear in his eyes. The terror that gripped him at the thought of what might happen if he told me everything. Mr. Harper. I repeated. My tone gentler now. You don't have to be afraid anymore. This is over. We're going to help the kids. You just need to tell me who else is involved. He swallowed hard. Looking over at Emma. Who was standing behind me. Her tiny face pale and anxious. She hadn't said a word since we left the basement. Her hands still clutching her bear tightly to her chest. She looked fragile. Like she might break at any moment. And it tore at me to see her like this. Finally, Mr. Harper spoke. His voice low and raspy. Almost as if the words were being dragged out of him. I don't know how it started, but I got involved with the wrong people. They promised me it would be easy money. They made me keep quiet. They made me do things, horrible things. I could feel the anger rising again. But I kept my emotions in check. This was the breakthrough I needed. The piece of the puzzle I had been waiting for. Who made you do this? I pressed. Who else is involved? His eyes darted nervously to the window. As though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. I don't know if I can say. They'll come after me if I talk. They'll. Before he could finish. I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. The moment I had been waiting for had arrived. And I wasn't going to waste any time. I grabbed my radio. Calling for immediate backup. Ordering the arrival of a larger team to secure the house and ensure that Mr. Harper couldn't escape. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. It couldn't be. This wasn't just about Mr. Harper. This was about something far bigger. Something that had roots deeper than I had imagined. The sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. And as I stepped back from Mr. Harper, I could hear Emma's voice. Small and trembling behind me. What will happen to him? I turned to face her, kneeling down to her level. She had been so brave, so strong. Despite everything she had been through, the weight of it all was too much for a child to bear. But somehow, she had managed. Emma, I said softly, my voice full of reassurance. He's not going anywhere for a long time. And we're going to make sure that no one else gets hurt. You're safe now. I promise. But as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was right, this wasn't over yet. With backup on the way, I turned back to Mr. Harper, who was now visibly sweating, his hands shaking as he looked over at me with an expression I couldn't read. His lips trembled as though he wanted to say something, but fear had sealed his tongue. Listen to me, Mr. Harper, I said firmly. You're not alone in this anymore. We'll protect you. But you have to help us stop this. Who else is involved? But the doorbell rang. And my thoughts were interrupted. I turned sharply, my heart racing again. This was it, the moment of truth. I had no idea who was on the other side of that door. But I knew one thing for sure, the story was far from over. The doorbell rang again. A sharp, insistent sound that echoed through the otherwise quiet house. I stood frozen for a moment. My mind racing as I wondered who could possibly be standing on the other side. The sirens were still faint in the distance. Backup was close. But something about the timing made my gut tighten. I turned to Mr. Harper, who was still sitting in the chair, his eyes wide with terror, as though the ringing bell was more terrifying than any police officer or any truth that was about to be uncovered. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice firm but controlled. I don't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. They said no one could know. They said you couldn't find out." His fear was palpable, and it made my own instincts flare. Someone had made him scared to speak. Someone who held enough power to silence him, to make him comply. The moment the doorbell rang, I had a sinking feeling that whoever was on the other side was part of the reason this nightmare had continued for so long. "Stay here," I said sharply, moving toward the door. I didn't wait for him to protest. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a brief second, I thought I might just burst through the door. But I had to remain calm. I had to know who it was first. I approached cautiously, my footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. I looked back at Emma, still clutching her bear, standing by the staircase. She hadn't moved much in the last few minutes, her eyes following me with silent trust. I offered her a quick nod, a silent promise that everything was going to be okay, though part of me wasn't so sure. As I reached the door, I hesitated. The doorbell rang again, this time louder. The person outside was growing impatient, and I couldn't afford to waste any more time. With a deep breath, I opened the door, stepping out into the cool evening air. The sight that greeted me was not what I expected. Standing before me was a young woman, probably in her early 30s, with a stern, composed expression on her face. Her eyes were dark, and there was something sharp about the way she held herself, as though she were constantly on edge. She was dressed professionally in a dark suit, but the air of authority around her was undeniable. "Can I help you?" I asked, my tone cautious but not unwelcoming. Her gaze scanned me quickly, taking in my uniform, my tense posture. She seemed to make a quick decision in her mind, and then she spoke, her voice steady and low. "I'm Detective Lawson," she said, introducing herself. "I've been assigned to this case. We need to talk about what you've found here. It's bigger than we thought." My heart skipped a beat. Another detective? From where? Why hadn't I heard about her until now? I instinctively reached for my radio, but she must have seen my reaction because she held up a hand. "Hold on," she said, her expression hardening. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." I stood there for a long moment, processing her words. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. How did she know about this? What was her angle? Was she with the right people? Or was she part of the problem? "You know what's been going on here, don't you?" she continued, her voice now a little more insistent. "The trafficking. The kids. We need to act fast. But we also need to make sure we don't tip our hand too soon." I stared at her, uncertain whether to trust her or not. "What exactly do you mean?" I asked cautiously. Her eyes darted behind me, to the living room. I could sense the urgency in her voice now. "This isn't just a local issue. We're dealing with something that spans several counties. Powerful people are involved. You're going to need more than backup. You need to make sure you don't alert them too soon. We'll do this together. But you need to follow my lead on this." Something about her demeanor made me uneasy. The way she spoke made it clear that she was well versed in the darker side of police work. It was like she was used to operating in the shadows. And it made me wonder just how deep this web of corruption ran. "I'm not sure I can trust you," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I wasn't about to let someone into this case unless I knew they were on my side. I've already been misled once today. I don't need more people toying with me. She didn't flinch at my words. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I get it. But you don't have a choice. I've been on this case for longer than you know. You've got the girl. But we need to move fast. If we don't, they'll scatter. And you won't be able to protect her anymore." Her words hung heavy in the air, And I knew deep down she was right. If I didn't trust her, if I didn't accept her help, we might lose everything we had worked for. I could see the look of determination in her eyes. The kind of look that told me she knew exactly what we were up against. I sighed, making my decision. "All right," I said, my voice low. "We'll do this your way. But I'm in charge here." She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course. Let's go save some kids." I nodded and motioned for her to follow me. As we stepped inside, I saw Emma's eyes lock on the new detective. A silent understanding passing between the two of them. I didn't know what was going to happen next. But one thing was clear, this was no longer just a routine case. It was something much bigger. And the road ahead would be filled with danger. We weren't just fighting for justice anymore. We were fighting for lives. And I couldn't let anyone else down. The weight of the night hung heavy on my shoulders as Detective Lawson and I made our way to the vehicle. The air felt cooler now. Almost suffocating. As if it were holding its breath. Waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every moment, every breath felt like it carried more weight than the last. It wasn't just about saving Emma anymore, it was about taking down a network that reached farther than I had imagined. A network built on the lives of children like her. We climbed into the unmarked car, the engine humming quietly as Lawson took the wheel. Her eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the road ahead. But I couldn't help but feel a growing unease. I was accustomed to the unpredictable nature of our work. But this was different. This wasn't a routine bust or a typical criminal investigation. This was something darker. Something I hadn't prepared for. "Do you know how deep this goes?" I asked. My voice steady but tinged with the weight of the question. She didn't answer right away. Her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as if weighing the truth in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "Honestly, I don't think anyone knows the full extent," she said. Her voice low, almost regretful. "But I know enough to understand that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are more victims. More families caught in this. And people in high places who are pulling the strings." I let her words settle in the silence that filled the car. I had suspected it all along, the whispers about corruption. The way people seemed to disappear. The strange lack of answers when I had asked the right questions. But hearing it confirmed by someone like Lawson only made it feel more real. "We've got to be careful," I said. More to myself than to her. "We can't make any mistakes. If we tip them off, we could lose everything." She nodded. Her eyes fixed on the road. "That's why we're going to do this my way. We can't afford to play by the book here." My mind raced with the implications of that. Every part of me screamed to follow procedure. To ensure everything was done by the book. But the truth was, the book didn't offer much hope when the system itself was the one protecting the people we were after. The sound of the tires against the asphalt was the only noise in the car as we drove through the quiet streets. The city's lights flashing by like the fleeting moments of our lives. I kept thinking about Emma. What would her life look like if she hadn't run into me on that fateful evening? Would she still be trapped in that house? Alone and forgotten? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. This was personal now. I wasn't just a cop doing his job. I was a man driven by the faces of the children who had suffered. By the image of Emma clutching her bear in fear. She had trusted me. And I couldn't let her down. We reached the outskirts of the town, where the lights began to dim and the quiet of the countryside took over. The dense trees cast long shadows across the road. And the atmosphere seemed to shift. The weight of the night pressing in around us. "Are we getting close?" I asked, breaking the silence. Lawson glanced over at me, her face unreadable. "We're about to make a stop. It's not far now." I nodded and stayed quiet, wondering where exactly we were heading. The answer came soon enough when Lawson turned down a narrow, gravel road. The headlights barely cutting through the dense woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for the sky. "Where are we going?" I asked again, my curiosity rising. This is one of the places where we've gotten intel about trafficking activity. Lawson replied. I think it's a drop-off point. I've been trying to get clearance for a raid. But you know how things go. They're always a step ahead. We pulled up in front of a small, unassuming house tucked deep within the woods. It was hidden from view, almost as though it were deliberately trying to stay off the radar. But there was something off about the place, something that didn't sit right in the pit of my stomach. The house was quiet. Too quiet. As though it had been abandoned. Wait here, Lawson said, her tone sharp as she turned off the engine. I'm going to take a look inside. I watched her get out of the car, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows. I sat there for a moment, my fingers tapping nervously on the dashboard. The air around me felt thick, charged with anticipation and fear. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the dark expanse of trees behind me. There was no going back now. If Lawson was right, this was one of the key points in the operation. We had to move quickly. A minute passed. Then 2. And just as I was about to step out and follow her, I heard a faint sound, footsteps in the dirt. Then a rustling sound coming from the direction of the house. My heart skipped a beat. And before I could react, I saw Lawson's figure emerge from the shadows. A worried expression on her face. We've got company, she said, her voice tight with urgency. We need to move now. The tension in her voice made my blood run cold. I didn't ask any questions. I threw the car into reverse and slammed the pedal to the floor, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. Lawson remained calm, but her eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror. I followed her lead, my pulse racing as the engine roared to life. The car lurched forward, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel road as I gunned the engine. Lawson's tense eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, her breath shallow, and I could sense the urgency radiating from her. We were being followed, there was no doubt about it now. The quiet, hidden woods that had once seemed peaceful were now a maze, closing in on us as we tore through the narrow road. The headlights barely cut through the thick darkness, and the shadows seemed to press in from all sides. I gritted my teeth, focusing entirely on the road ahead. My mind was racing, thinking of the possible outcomes, each one darker than the last. How had they known we were here? Had they been watching us from the start? The thought was unsettling, but there was no time to dwell on it now. Lawson reached for her radio, her voice steady despite the anxiety that hung in the air. Unit 247, requesting backup. We've got multiple vehicles on our tail. Suspects in pursuit. She paused, her eyes scanning the road ahead. Keep it quiet. No sirens. Copy that. Unit 247. Backup en route. Stay safe, came the response from dispatch, the static barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I swerved the car to the left, narrowly avoiding a large tree branch that hung low, its sharp edges scraping against the metal. Lawson muttered something under her breath, her hand tightening on the armrest as we continued down the winding road, the lights of the following vehicles growing closer with every second. Hold on, I shouted as I took a sharp turn, the tires screeching against the gravel. Lawson braced herself, her eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. They're gaining on us, she said, a note of concern slipping into her voice. We can't outrun them forever. I wasn't about to let them catch us. I pushed the car harder, my foot pressing down on the accelerator until the engine screamed in protest. We needed to get out of this forest, back into open roads where we could make a stand. But just as I thought we might escape, a sharp crack rang out from behind us. A shot. I barely had time to react as a bullet pierced the rear window, the glass shattering into 1,000 tiny fragments that exploded into the back seat. The sound of the bullet's impact was deafening, and I instinctively ducked, my hands tightening around the wheel. Lawson's face was pale as she ducked down, trying to shield herself from the incoming fire. Hold on, I barked again, pushing the car to its limits. The next corner loomed ahead. And I knew if I took it too fast, we'd end up off the road and into the trees. But slowing down would only give them a better shot at us. I took the corner hard. The tires screeching again. The car tilting dangerously before it straightened out. We were in the clear for now. But the silence that followed the frantic screeching of tires was deafening. I didn't let up. My eyes scanned the road ahead, praying we'd make it out of this alive. "Are you okay?" I asked. My voice strained as I glanced at Lawson. She nodded, her hand still gripping the armrest, her knuckles white. "I'm fine. Just drive." We hit the main road a moment later, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as I accelerated down the straight path. The headlights of the cars behind us were distant now, but I wasn't about to let my guard down. They could be anywhere, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Do you have a plan?" Lawson asked, her voice even, though I could hear the hint of worry beneath it. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "But we need to get to that warehouse." "Lawson, that's where everything connects. If we don't get there first, we'll lose it all." She turned her head toward me, her eyes sharp with determination. "Then let's go. We can't waste any more time." I didn't hesitate. I knew where the warehouse was. It was an old, abandoned industrial building, just on the outskirts of town. It had been a hot spot for criminal activity for years, but no one had ever been able to pin anything on it. Now, we had the intel. We had the lead. And we couldn't afford to let it slip away. I pushed the car into overdrive, the engine roaring in protest. But I didn't care. Every second counted. As we approached the outskirts of town, I could feel the tension in the car rise. We were getting close. My mind was racing, replaying every detail of the investigation so far, the strange behavior of the suspects, the mysterious disappearances, and the whispered rumors of child trafficking that had always seemed too impossible to believe. But now, everything was pointing to one place, the warehouse. "I need backup," I said into the radio, my voice steady despite the panic that threatened to rise. "I'm heading to the warehouse now. Get here fast." "Copy that. Unit 247. Backup en route," came the response. We reached the warehouse, the hulking silhouette looming in the distance. I slowed the car, parking behind a nearby building to avoid being spotted. The night was thick with tension. The only sound the steady hum of our breath and the distant chirping of insects. "This is it," Lawson said, her voice low. She reached for her weapon, her movements steady and precise. "Stay sharp. We go in quiet." I nodded, my hand gripping my own weapon as we got out of the car, moving quickly toward the entrance of the warehouse. The building was old, the air musty and stale, but I could feel the weight of something more sinister inside. We were close now, and whatever we found inside that warehouse would change everything. The door creaked as we pushed it open, the heavy wooden frame groaning under the pressure. The dim light from our flashlights flickered briefly before illuminating the vast space before us. The warehouse was cavernous, filled with stacked crates and old industrial equipment that seemed to have been left abandoned for years. The smell of dust and mildew hung thick in the air, making each breath feel like inhaling ancient memories. I motioned for Lawson to follow as we stepped inside, our footsteps muffled by the layer of dust on the concrete floor. The warehouse felt eerily silent. The only sounds the faint hum of distant machinery and the occasional scurrying of rats. The place was a labyrinth of old crates and shelves, each one stacked high and labeled with obscure codes that meant nothing to us. But I had no doubt that somewhere in this maze, we'd find what we were looking for. "We need to split up," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the vast space. "Check the back corner. I'll search the front." Lawson nodded, her expression serious as she carefully moved toward the back of the warehouse, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. I watched her go, my heart beating loudly in my chest, before I turned my attention back to the front of the room. The atmosphere felt thick with something I couldn't quite name, a sense of foreboding that had settled deep within my bones. I moved cautiously, scanning the stacks of crates and machinery, but my eyes kept drifting toward the far corner of the warehouse, where a large metal door stood slightly ajar. It was out of place, almost too obvious. My instincts told me that it was no coincidence, that the door was meant to be hidden, to keep people like us away from whatever was inside. I made my way toward it, my breath catching as I reached the door. A faint light from the other side flickered through the crack, casting strange shadows across the room. I pressed my hand against the cold metal, feeling the chill seep into my skin. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside, my flashlight beam illuminating a small room that was starkly different from the rest of the warehouse. This room was well organized, almost clinical in its appearance. Shelves lined the walls, filled with files and folders, each meticulously arranged. But what caught my eye wasn't the documents, it was the small television monitors, each one showing a different part of the warehouse. Some were blank, while others displayed images of children, their faces blank, their bodies still. My stomach churned as I stepped closer to the monitors, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. These were the missing children, the same ones who had been vanishing from the neighborhood. Their images flickered on the screen, some of them asleep, others simply sitting in corners, their eyes vacant and lost. I heard a soft click behind me, and I spun around to find Lawson standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with horror as she took in the scene. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where they've been keeping them," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "This is bigger than we thought." Lawson moved closer to the monitors, her hand instinctively reaching for her radio. "We need backup," she said urgently. "Now." I nodded, already reaching for my own radio. But before I could speak, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of doors slamming. I froze, my body tensing as the realization hit: someone was coming. Someone who didn't want us to find this place. "Get down," I hissed, pulling Lawson behind a stack of crates just as the door to the small room burst open. A group of men, their faces obscured by masks, stormed in. They were heavily armed, their weapons trained on the empty space where we had just been. I motioned for Lawson to stay still as I reached for my own weapon, my mind racing. This wasn't just a raid anymore, it was a fight for survival. If we didn't move fast, we'd be caught. And if we were caught, everything we had worked for, the children, the evidence, would be lost. The men were talking to each other, their voices low and urgent. But I couldn't make out what they were saying. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, as they moved further into the room, inspecting the monitors, checking the files. My heart was racing now, each beat louder than the last. I had to think fast. We couldn't stay hidden forever. We had to act. "Now," I whispered to Lawson, my voice barely audible. She nodded, her grip tight on her gun as she prepared to make a move. We waited until the men were distracted, their backs turned. And then, in a split second, we both sprang into action. I fired first, the shot ringing out and hitting one of the men in the shoulder. He staggered back, but he didn't go down. Lawson followed suit, her shot hitting another man in the leg, causing him to drop to the ground with a cry. "Stay down," I shouted. But the men were already retaliating, their shots ringing out, the sound of gunfire echoing through the warehouse. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, and I could feel my heart racing as the fight intensified. I ducked behind a stack of crates, my body pressed flat against the cold concrete as I returned fire. I could hear Lawson's shots ringing out next to me, her steady hand providing cover as we moved from crate to crate, inching closer to the door. But just as I thought we might have a chance to escape, I heard a shout from behind me. "Get down," a voice shouted. And before I could react, I felt a searing pain in my side. The world around me spun as I hit the ground, my vision blurring as the blood from my wound soaked through my uniform. I gasped for air, my body trembling as the reality of the situation set in. Lawson's voice cut through the haze. "Stay with me. We're almost there," she shouted, her hands frantic as she tried to staunch the bleeding. I tried to nod, but my vision was fading, the world growing dim. "Get them out," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "Save the children." And with that, everything went black. The cold concrete floor was rough against my back as I struggled to breathe. My side was burning with pain, each breath a painful reminder of how much was at stake. I could hear Lawson's frantic voice, her hands working to stop the bleeding. But everything felt so far away. The world around me was blurring, becoming distant as the blood continued to spill from my wound. I tried to focus, but it was hard to keep my mind from drifting, my thoughts becoming a haze of fear and regret. "Stay with me, Frank." Lawson's voice was clear, but strained. I felt her hands on my chest, pressing down hard, trying to keep me conscious. "Don't you dare go anywhere." I forced myself to focus on her words, on her face above me, so full of determination. She wasn't giving up. I couldn't let her do this alone. "How bad is it?" I rasped, my voice barely audible. But I had to know. I had to understand if I could make it. "You're not bleeding out," Lawson said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the edge of panic in her voice. "But you're close, Frank. Just stay with me, all right?" I nodded weakly, trying to steady my breath. Every inhale felt like a struggle, but I focused on Lawson's hands on my wound, her calm presence anchoring me. If there was one thing I knew, it was that she wasn't going to let me die here, not today. Not on her watch. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and I tensed, instinctively reaching for my gun, though my strength was fading. But Lawson stopped me, her hand on my wrist, holding me still. "We've got to get out of here," she muttered under her breath, her eyes darting toward the door. "Backup's on the way." "But we can't wait. You need to move, Frank. You need to move now." My eyes fought to stay open as I tried to lift myself off the ground. My body felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. But the urgency in Lawson's voice cut through the fog in my mind. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. "You take the lead," I said, gritting my teeth as I pushed myself up, my side aching with every movement. "I'll follow." Lawson nodded, her expression grim as she helped me to my feet, her hand around my waist, supporting me. We couldn't waste time. We had to move quickly before reinforcements arrived, or worse, before the men who had ambushed us could regroup and take us down. We made our way toward the exit, each step feeling like a victory as the adrenaline started to kick in. Every inch of the warehouse felt like a battle zone, with shadows and crates hiding danger around every corner. But we moved together, one step at a time, carefully checking every hallway, every doorway, every darkened corner. As we neared the exit, the sound of voices reached our ears. The footsteps were getting louder, more urgent. They knew we were still inside. "We're almost there," Lawson whispered, her voice low, her eyes scanning the hallway. "Just a little farther." I nodded, my grip tightening on my weapon, my focus sharpening despite the pain that still lingered in my side. We couldn't be caught here. We couldn't let everything we had fought for slip away. We reached the exit and pushed the heavy door open, the fresh air outside a welcome relief. But our escape was short-lived. Before we could fully step into the open air, we were met with a wall of gunfire. The sound was deafening as the bullets whizzed past us, narrowly missing. My heart pounded in my chest as we dove behind a nearby stack of crates for cover. "Stay down," Lawson shouted, her voice urgent. I could hear the panic in her words. But we both knew this was far from over. "They're not letting us go that easily." I took a deep breath, forcing my body to stay calm despite the chaos around me. The warehouse was alive with the sound of gunfire, the crack of bullets ricocheting off metal, the heat of the battle rising with each passing second. But I couldn't let myself falter. Not now. I turned to Lawson, meeting her eyes. "We need to get to the perimeter," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos. "We can make it out if we just." The sharp sound of footsteps interrupted me, and I looked up, my heart sinking. A group of armed men had appeared at the far end of the warehouse, blocking our escape route. There were too many of them. Well, one of the men sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Thought you could escape? Heh. Not so easy, is it?" I gritted my teeth, my gun trained on them. "You're not going to win this," I said, my voice a low growl. "Not while I'm still breathing." Lawson raised her gun, her finger on the trigger. "We're not done yet," she said, her tone fierce. "We still have a chance." But even as she said it, I knew the odds were stacked against us. We had been outnumbered, outgunned. And yet we were still standing. We still had something to fight for. The men slowly closed in on us. But I wasn't about to let them take us down without a fight. Not when the children's lives were on the line. Not when Lawson had put everything on the line to help me. "On three," I whispered, my hand tightening on my weapon. 1, 2, 3. We opened fire simultaneously, the sound of gunshots reverberating through the warehouse. A sharp, staccato rhythm. Our aim was true, and the first wave of men went down. But there were more, always more. "Move," I shouted, pulling Lawson with me as we ducked behind another stack of crates. "We're getting out of here. Together." And as we made our move, my mind raced. I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up. But I was damn sure we weren't going to stop fighting. Not until every last child was free. Not until the people behind this operation were brought to justice. With every step, every bullet fired, I knew we were getting closer to ending this nightmare. And that kept me going. It had to. In the end, justice was served. The children were freed. Their lives forever changed. But so were we. Lawson and I walked away from the chaos, exhausted but resolute, knowing that the fight wasn't over. But we had won a crucial battle. As the dawn broke, the sun shining brightly over a now peaceful town, I realized that the true victory wasn't just about bringing the criminals to justice, it was about the courage to stand up, to keep fighting for what's right, no matter the cost. Maya, that brave little girl, had led us to the truth. And in her, I saw the hope of a future free from fear. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming tales. Stay tuned for our next adventure. And thank you for watching.